Greetings and welcome to Wisconsin in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I am Dan McCaleb, executive editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me again today is Benjamin Yount, the Center Square's Wisconsin correspondent. How are you, Ben?
I've got my arm out of my sling and I can kind of move my hand. I think that I'm maybe a month away from actually being able to type again. So, banner day in the Yount household.
I was going to say, that's progress. You're getting there. Congratulations on that first step. Hope a continued speedy recovery.
Well, I don't want it to be too fast. I mean, then the wife's going to want me to rake leaves and let the dogs out and do all that. I mean, come on, man. Yeah, I got to milk this.
You had to remind me. We are getting into raking leaves season, aren't we? Ugh. Ben, let's get to the news. Education outcomes were a topic at thecentersquare.com. You reported it, and reading directly from your story at thecentersquare.com from earlier this week, nearly 60% of students in Wisconsin public schools continue to be unable to read, write, or do math at the grade level. The state's Department of Public Instruction released the latest standardized test scores on Tuesday. We're recording this on Thursday, October 12th, by the way. And frankly, the results aren't all that pretty. Ben, what can you tell our listeners about it?
Yeah, this is a story that, let me say this, to say that 60% of kids in Wisconsin cannot read or write at grade level is in and of itself not new news. That's been about the level for, I've been up here, 6 years? And that's been the story every single one of those years. The reason we wrote it the way we did at the Center Square was because the AP had a headline that said student achievement highest in years, still not where they were before the coronavirus. And so that's the problem, is that you can take a look at these numbers. And the spin from the state of Wisconsin was, hey, look, these numbers are up from last year, and these are the highest numbers since that test that they took before the coronavirus. Because you got to remember, they didn't take a coronavirus test in the spring, or they didn't take standardized tests in the spring of 20. So those tests were completely wiped away. So when you take a look at, 38% and 39% proficiency levels, you're technically better than you've been since 2018. That's almost 5 years. Kids in Wisconsin are doing better. Less bad is not good. And when you barely have 40%, in fact, it's under 40% of kids who are proficient or better in math and reading, then, that's not necessarily good.
Of course, during the COVID-19, the early months of COVID-19, state and local governments forced schools to close, force students into remote learning. We all know how that went. It was an unmitigated disaster, learning loss, not just in Wisconsin, but across the country. And, here we are 4 years later, 4 years on, and students have still not rebounded to what was not very good pre-COVID-19 numbers. Ben, you said you had some tape that you wanted to play for us.
Yeah. One of the other aspects that you have to talk about, that we have to talk about when we talk about Wisconsin public schools, is Milwaukee. Milwaukee public schools have the worst racial achievement gap in the country. That black kids in Milwaukee do worse than white kids compared to every other city across the country. And in this latest round of test scores, those racial numbers didn't change. Reporter we were all on a conference call with the Department of Public Instruction, the people who run public schools here in Wisconsin. And the question to the spokesperson, a woman by the name of Abigail Sweats, was, we see here that the racial achievement gap numbers have not closed. What's the response to that? And this was the response. And I want you to listen how many times this spokesperson for DPI talks about reading or math, talks about helping kids read better or learn how to do better, talks about improving test scores. It's about a minute. So just keep an ear out for how many times the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, on the day that reading and math numbers come out, talks about reading and math.
This is one of the reasons that we say recovery journey is great. I'm glad we're on a recovery journey, and we're not where we want to be yet. We wouldn't be where we want to be even if we had gotten to exactly the same point as we've been before, because we are really always worried and always very, very focused on how can we close these racial disparities when it comes to the achievement and the proficiency scores that we're seeing in our tests. So a few things about that. As I'm sure you read or heard in our State of Education address, we are talking again and always about making sure that our students are feeling affirmed and welcomed in our schools. That includes our Black, Indigenous, and students of color. That includes our LGBTQ plus students. And it really goes to what we believe so strongly about the whole student, making sure that they are very safe and supported in our schools. That is not the only thing that is going to change the disparities we're seeing, but it is a thing that we think can go a long way towards really pushing that needle.
Affirmed and welcomed, safe and supported. Not once did the spokesperson for the Department of Public Instruction talk about reading or math or science or social studies or any of the other areas where kids are behind in Wisconsin public schools. And that frustrated an awful lot of not only Republican lawmakers at the Capitol, but education advocates, because Wisconsin is one of the centerpieces of the school choice movement across the country. And the Institute for Reforming Government, who we quoted in our story, Will Flanders over at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, who we quoted in our story, said not only are these numbers bad, 60% of kids cannot read or write the way they should. They said these numbers show just why school choice is so popular and that school choice schools here in Wisconsin are continuing to do a better job, kid by kid, city by city, case by case, than Wisconsin's public schools. One last thing. We're going to write a story next week with the Institute for Reforming Government that talks about how Milwaukee schools are not improving. Milwaukee schools are as bad as Baltimore and Detroit, yet Milwaukee public schools haven't changed in years. The woman who is now going to be in charge of Baltimore schools is the woman who was hired to revamp education in the state of Mississippi. The Mississippi Miracle, talk to somebody in education and they'll bring you up. And the point that the Institute for Reforming Government made is that Milwaukee and Wisconsin schools are focusing on other things as opposed to having a hyper focus on reading, because, and this is true in every single school district across the country, if you can't read by the fourth grade, you're going to be behind in the eighth grade. You're going to be behind when you graduate from college. You're going to be behind for the rest of your life, and you are never going to catch up. And that's what a lot of these education reformers are taking away from these numbers. How many years, they say, do we have to sit and watch mediocrity at best, or more kids fail before somebody finally does something to improve reading and math and science and social studies and the rest of the core subjects in schools?
Well, it does sound like Milwaukee schools and schools statewide have some work to do. Hopefully, Ben, they're working on a plan, but we are out of time. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. For Ben Yount, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe. Thank you for listening.